Hello, everybody. This is Steve May. I'm here with Sydney Milanese. How old are you, Sydney?
I'm 20.
Sydney is 20. Wait, when was your birthday again?
My birthday is actually today.
Oh my
It is
God!
today.
Oh my God!
I'm
And I
kidding.
didn't know.
No, I wouldn't
I
be saying that.
didn't
No, yeah,
know.
it's crazy.
Happy
Yeah.
birthday,
Thank
Sydney.
you. Thank you.
That's, I think, good juju for our conversation. We'll
It is.
see how
It's
it
a
pans out.
win-win. Thank you.
Well, we need to go for a birthday cake in a minute. But in the meantime, we're going to chat to you about a bunch of different things. So Sydney is 20 years old today. I'm not 20 years old today. Excuse me. I'm a little older than that. Probably about the same age as her parents. And last week, we were chatting very, very briefly about some of the overarching dynamics of parent-child relationships. And I want to talk about some of those things today. And what I think we're going to be talking about are these things. One is this notion of trauma, because it's a heavy duty word and it kind of sounds like something truly god awful has happened to you. And many people, Sydney's aged, don't necessarily feel that. They think, well, I've only just started my life. Some do, but a lot don't. And so let's start talking about that, what I mean by trauma, because it's kind of a little key component of a bit of a little pyramid, if you like, of philosophical thinking, which I think can be incredibly useful as we're developing work and developing in our lives. I want to talk about two combined issues. One is what we might call the conditioned self, this idea that we're not really living our authentic lives, we're living, I don't know, someone else's little story of who we are. And that's a particularly acute thing that can, I think, affect us when we're between the ages of, I don't know, 14 and 23, something like that, at that particular decade. Very often is a decade, I think, of trying to seek to define yourself for yourself. Sydney's going to tell me whether I'm talking complete and utter guff in a minute or not. I'll talk about that. And then also wanted to talk about what we might define as the psychology of dependency and approval. So this is a very big Jungian idea, and there's a wonderful writer, Joseph Campbell, that talks about this a lot, and he's picking up on what Jung talks about, and Jung, of course, is picking up on stories that are 1,000 years old, but the idea of killing what we might call the infantile ego. So Jung was very keen on saying we spend the first 40 years of our life understanding and discovering what our ego is. And once we've defined it, we need to kill it off and we start all over again. And I think that's an interesting idea. So I want to talk about that, particularly from the perspective of someone who is about 20 years old and the nature of the relationships that you have with your parents and other kind of mentor figures. Finally, if we have time, I want to talk about this notion of assertiveness, trying to define what we mean by assertiveness, because I think if we can get that definition good, it can be enormously helpful in the key relationships that we have, not least with our parents, actually. Being able to talk our truth, to speak our truth to people who we have probably been trained to respect in a particular way from the moment we were born. And we need to be able to, I think, express ourselves clearly, authentically, independently from our childishness. We can't be kids for the whole of our life, I don't think. I think it's a poor way to live. So let's start off with this idea of trauma, because if I say to you, what do you think trauma is? How would you define that in your life? What pops into your head if I say trauma?
I would say that trauma is something that makes you mentally feel paralyzed from moving forward.
Okay, so if you're thinking of conversations that you've had with your mates, your peer group, and think back over perhaps the last year or so of being at school in the States, what we would call college or university here, can you think of a couple of instances where people have been shared a confidence with you about something that was pretty painful that you would describe as traumatic? I mean, obviously, we don't want to hear any names or anything, but just broadly, what are the sort of circumstances? I would imagine you've had conversations about things that have been very upsetting to other people. What sort of stuff comes up?
Probably just the struggles or hardships that they've gone through in past relationships, whether it's with other friends or whether it's with significant others from the past. I would say that's probably the main thing, or even with their families.
Okay, and so can you think of let's see if we can focus it perhaps on a particular conversation or event. Can you think of an individual? Again, we don't want any names or anything, but can you think of an individual perhaps who was very particularly upset about leaving a family unit and traveling because you're studying in Chicago? Perhaps someone a bit like you who's come from a different state. So you're from Texas, Houston, Texas.
Yeah.
That's quite a distance and it's quite a cultural shift
Yeah.
from the South to the Yankees. Can you think of a friend who had something similar, who shared with you a sadness, a sense of loss, or a sense of anxiety?
Well, I had one friend who doesn't even go to my college, but she was having a difficulty with transitioning to her own, and she would very much call me and confide in me about issues she was dealing with that she felt like she couldn't go to others about. And she wasn't making or connecting, I guess, with the necessarily right people or the people she thought she would have met at this school. And one of the bad things that happened was that she began to feel very isolated because she didn't have this group except for me and one of our other mutual friends and then her family. So she became very isolated, which made her feel very lonely, and which is never good. And so she confided in me, but also one positive thing though she gained from that experience was that she became closer obviously with me and my other friend, and then also she became a lot closer with her family and confided in them and used them as her prime support team.
So, did you feel that she had the tools, in a sort of general sense, to seek the help that she needed when she felt low?
I definitely think that she had the tools needed to break the isolation that she was going through, and even if she didn't necessarily have a direct support system where she was at, she definitely had the support system overall because she had me and our other friend who she could trust to talk about all the issues she was dealing with and the ups and downs she was going through. And she also mainly had her family as well to guide her and help her.
So, what I would, it strikes me that what you were doing is what I would broadly call a sort of mentor role in that young person's life. They happen to be the same age as you or thereabouts. How did you learn this stuff? Where did you learn to do that?
I think I mainly, I guess, learned this through my parents and just me and my family being so close. It's almost like an odd closeness. There's like no filter between us. And so I think just their openness on being there for me whenever I need them to definitely showed me that I need to be open to anyone and in anything that they're going through, and be welcoming for them to come to.
And I think particularly for young people, the word trauma tends to have a strong association with physical experience of one sort or another. It could be physical abuse, but more commonly probably is a thing like a car wreck and so on. The stuff that I'm more interested in a way is any emotional experience that makes you feel unsafe, that makes you feel insecure emotionally, because there is a strong, and now we're getting into a little bit of almost academic stuff, but there's a strong school of thought that we're, as young adults, very much defined by repetitive experiences that we have very, very early on in our life, sometimes before we can even remember, maybe 3 or 4 years old, which embed in us a sense of insecurity about ourself. And that what happens is certain defense mechanisms kick in at that point. We become a certain type of person. We develop a personality style, which is an obstacle to us actually behaving in a way which is our most authentic self. So simple examples would be that we become people pleasers, or we become emotionally distant, or we become narcissistic. We think everything is about ourselves and so on. Now, we can be over schematic about this stuff, but what I'm very interested in is when people are having a tricky time at college, or when they're having a tricky time in their first job and feeling disassociated, do they have access to the tools that can be useful to them to get them out of that way of thinking, out of that thought process? That's the sort of work that I do.
To continue listening to Steve and Sydney's conversation, please click the next video that deals with the mentality of a victim versus a victor.